Three Religious Rebels, Chapter 7. This chapter is entitled, Row, Sailor, Row. The old abbot gazed with admiration at the garden in front of his room. The sun glistening on the dewy grass and flowers reminded him of a jeweled landscape of the apocalypse. Father Morris put an end to his musing by entering after a sharp knock. "Come in," said the abbot. "Your face is not much like the face of nature this morning, Father Prior. You should steal dewdrops from the night to brighten your morning." "I often wish there was no morning to my night," answered the prior sourly. "What is this I hear about Father Robert? Are you sending him away again?" "Again?" echoed the abbot. "Did I ever send him away before?" "Didn't you send him to Tonnerre?" "Of course not," said the abbot. "He was elected by St. Michael's community, just as he has been elected by the community of St. Aoûl." "Why couldn't they elect one of their own?" frowned the prior. "For the same reason St. Michael's couldn't. They think Robert better than anyone they have. And," added the abbot, "I don't think they are greatly mistaken, do you?" "You know what I think of Robert," Morris said. "You know what I have thought of him for the last 40 years. But," and an anxious look came over the prior's face, "aren't you afraid?" "Of what?" "Of Robert's spirit. He's sure to try his reform again," argued the prior, "and of course it will fail. Oh, I know he came back and admitted his defeat like a man, but even though it's 7 years since he's returned, I can still see at times that he has not forgotten." "You have good eyes, Father Morris," was the only comment that came from the abbot. The prior noted the tremble in the old man's wax-like hands as they lay in his lap. Both men were momentarily lost in reverie. A knock aroused them. "Come in," called the abbot. "Ah," he exclaimed as the door opened, "it is you, my good son Robert. Come in and cheer an old man's heart, and perhaps you can also chase the gloom from the sour face of our excellent prior." Morris snorted as he drew 2 chairs nearer the abbot's desk. "We were just speaking of the opportunity that is yours at St. Aoûl's," said Dom Bernard. "Opportunity for heartbreak," growled Morris. "How cheerful," said Robert as he studied the face of his friend. "And what were you saying, Reverend Father?" "Well," said the old man smilingly, "I wasn't allowed to say very much. Our prior here did most of the talking. He accused me of sending you to torture or some such thing. But that doesn't matter. What we want to know is what you think of the opportunity." Robert looked from the abbot to the prior and back again before he said, "I'm very grateful for it, but I must also be honest. I'm 55 years old." Then after a slight pause he smiled and said, "I know both of you are wondering if I will repeat my performance at Tonnerre." "No," said the abbot musingly, "not exactly. I think myself and our grouchy prior were really wondering if St. Aoûl's will repeat the performance of Tonnerre. We both knew you would try." "But what's the use?" broke in Morris. "Didn't Tonnerre teach you anything? Why can't you go on as you've been going these past 7 years? You didn't attempt any reform here. You conformed. And you didn't lose any merit by it. Neither did God lose any glory. Ah, you'll never learn," he concluded disgustedly. "Think of it, 40 years with one idea." Abbot Bernard touched the aroused Morris gently on the knee. 40 is a mystical number, Father Prior. Remember your scripture, 40 years, 40 days, 40 nights. Perhaps our Robert is approaching his promised land. Who ever promised him any? Robert smiled but said nothing. Abbot Bernard fingered his crucifix. Maurice turned and looked out the window angrily. Just before the silence became oppressive, Robert straightened in his chair, ran his tongue across dry lips, and said, "Look, my fathers, don't you think I have seen how much easier it would be to follow the general trend of the times? Don't you realize that Tonnerre showed me clearly just how deeply the monks of the day are rutted?" No answer came from either of the men facing him. Robert's voice lowered as he went on. To have a whole community rise up and reject a man's ideal before his very face sobers him. You can be sure that I have prayed and thought. Again and again, I have asked myself what I would do were I given another chance. My fathers, the answer has always been the same. There it is, and his hand pointed to the crucifix on Dom Bernard's desk. A new and unaccustomed tenderness crept into Robert's tone as he concluded. Christ did not come down from his cross. Why should I shrink from shouldering mine? Because it's of your own making, snapped Maurice. What justification have you for forcing your subjective interpretation of the rule on any community? Why can't you take the current opinion? Perhaps because it is current and only an opinion, answered Robert. If Christ fought one thing in his day, it was current opinion. You're right, came the fiery reply from the prior. And if I mistake not, the current opinion he excoriated was the one of observing the letter of the law while neglecting its spirit. Robert's head shook from side to side quite wearily. Maurice, how many times do I have to insist that I am going back to the letter only to recapture the true spirit? But why go hunting for something you already possess? Haven't you been living the true spirit for 40 years? Robert looked at the old abbot and shrugged his shoulders helplessly. The old man smiled at his evident distress. Maurice caught the interchange. Then bending forward, he included both in his address. Let me ask you two this one question. Is it our duty to do today just exactly what our forefathers did in their day? Or to do just exactly what our forefathers would do if they were living in our day? Both abbots pondered a moment. Maurice went on. In other words, are we to be guided by their practices or their principles? That's the point at issue in this whole affair and nothing else. Slowly, Dom Bernard nodded affirmatively. Maurice proceeded. I admit that we are far from Benedict's primitive practices, but I stoutly maintain that we are following every one of his principles, and that, he concluded, is exactly what Benedict would do in this year of grace, 1073. I'll call it a year of disgrace if you keep arguing that way, said Robert. Then lifting the edge of his scapular toward the prior, he said, Feel that? Maurice rubbed it between his thumb and index finger. Need any knight, lord, or duke be ashamed of such material? Maurice did not answer. Do I live by the labor of my own hands, or by that of the hands of others? Still, Maurice did not answer. I've heard some people insist that our Lord beautified poverty of spirit, not actual poverty, said Robert tersely. But in all my 55 years of life, I have learned no surer, safer, speedier way of arriving at that poverty of spirit than by being actually poor. Reverend Father, Isn't the fundamental weakness in the monastic world today its lack of true poverty? Bah, snorted Morris. Not so fast, Morris, not quite so fast. You've told me yourself that the present-day monk hasn't enough to do. Liturgical functions crowd his day. He has few interests. Mentally, he goes to seed. Physically, he gets fat and lazy. Here's the cure. Let the monastery be actually poor, as well as poor in spirit, and your monk will not be mooning away his life. The aged Bernard had listened most attentively. There is just one thing that worries me, my good Robert. Father Morris gave it to me this morning. It is this. Can you, my son, can you sustain another failure? Robert reached across the desk and laid his hand on Dom Bernard's crucifix. May I? He asked as he lifted it. The abbot bowed. Tonnerre put me on my knees before this crucified king. It put me there crying as one wounded, pleading as one distraught, begging as one beside himself. And there on my knees I learned the lesson of the cross. Christianity is not a cult of success. No one spoke for a moment. Do you now see why I have no fear of failure? Robert's eyes were still fastened on the crucifix. For me, there can be no such thing. Dom Bernard arose. With that spirit, my son, he said, there can be no failure for you in any sense. Not 4 months later, when autumn was holding high carnival before the long white fast of winter, St. Pierre's prior was hastily summoned to the gate by a breathless porter. Father Morris did not like the summons at all. He was on the point of scolding the porter for such an intrusion, but on hearing the man's message, he hurriedly left the room. Impatience was evident in the very flutter of his scapular as he strode down the avenue of trees that led to the gate. He brushed through the porter's lodge and flung open the outer door. Throwing both arms wide in a gesture of welcome, he cried, Robert! The chestnut mare, with the blaze of white on her forehead, pranced uneasily. Robert smiled down from the saddle. I have a mettlesome mount, Morris, but she isn't half as spirited as her rider. I can't stay long, but you must read this. He drew a scroll from beneath his belt and handed it to the prior. Morris unrolled the letter hurriedly. It was from Rome. Then his eyes opened in wonder. Pope Alexander was commanding Robert of St. Aiols to take charge of the hermits at Cologne. The message was brief. It ended with a blessing, but it left Morris bewildered. Just a little secret I kept from you for years, Morris, said Robert as he re-rolled the document and tucked it beneath his scapular. When I was at Tonnerre, these men asked me to guide them. I was willing, but the community at Tonnerre refused to let me go. Get off that horse, Morris commanded. Get off that horse and spend the day with me. Can't, came the short reply as the mare sidestepped impatiently. I must cover 10 more leagues before nightfall. Sorry Abbot Bernard is away. I wanted to see both of you before I rode on. Seeing that his friend was in earnest, Morris wheeled about and called to the porter. Have a horse saddled at once. I would ride with the abbot. Seeing that his friend was in earnest, Morris wheeled about and called to the porter, Have a horse saddled at once. I will ride with the abbot. 10 minutes later, the 2 monks had left the city of Troyes behind them and were entering a shady stretch of wood. Bit by bit, Morris drew the story from his friend. In 1065, just when the dash between Robert and the men of Tonnerre was at its height, a lone hermit from Cologne had come to the monastery begging Robert to lead him and his companions on the way to God. The young abbot had considered him a messenger sent by heaven to end the impasse between himself and his community. But as he had been voted into office, Robert would have to be voted out. So sure was he of the outcome of the balloting that he had the hermit remain at Tonnerre, confident that he would be accompanying him back to Caen. But the next morning he learned much about the contrariness that lies deep in the sons of Adam, for the men who would not receive his reform rejected the opportunity to be rid of him. The vote was almost unanimous against his going to Cologne. When Maurice asked why he had kept this matter secret these past 7 years, Robert said he was afraid old Abbot Bernard would get in touch with the hermits and send him on to them. Then it would look as if he had resigned from Tonnerre only to go to Cologne. He had resolved to place the matter entirely in the hands of God. At this point, Maurice turned to his companion and said, "Has no one ever told you the advice of the captain to the man in the boat? Trust in God, sailor, but row for shore. If you had pulled an oar back in 1065, you would have saved yourself and these hermits 7.5 years. Yes, and I would have spent the rest of my life wondering whether I was doing my own will or the will of God," replied Robert. "Now there can be no doubt." As they neared the edge of the wood and caught sight of the sun-drenched square stones of the old Roman road, Maurice reined in his steed and told Robert that they could water their horses at a brook that was a little to their left. The abbot dismounted and led his mare after the prior's dappled gray mount. As the two horses stood with their forefeet in the swirling waters, drinking noisily from the stream, Maurice frowned angrily and said, "But the agony of 7 years waiting? I have my scars, Maurice, but don't forget that he was crucified." "But there are no buts, Maurice," said the abbot as he examined the bit in the mare's dripping mouth. "Even though men do to us all that his enemies did to him, we can only do what he did. We must pray for their forgiveness by the only one who has a right to be offended." Maurice was silent. He could never get anywhere with Robert once the latter began to talk about Christ. Soon they were on the road again, and the refreshed horses set the stones ringing with their trotting hoofs. Robert had little to say about St. Aeules. He had not been there long enough to try his reform. All his thoughts seemed focused on Cologne. When Maurice learned that only 7 men awaited him there, he showed his distaste. But Robert laughed away his opposition with the merry words, "Better a few good than a multitude not so good." By the time they reached another wood, the sun was well down toward the west. Robert pulled up his mare and insisted that Maurice turn back. As it was, he pointed out, the prior would not reach Troyes before dark. Maurice resisted for a while. He had a feeling that this parting was final. The feeling had increased with every step of the way. He was loath to leave his friend, but he knew that Robert was right. At last he brought his mount alongside the mare, laid his hand on Robert's shoulder, and said, "God be with you always." Robert leaned out of the saddle, gave his friend a kiss of peace, and whispered, "He will abide, though all else abandon." They exchanged blessings, turned their horses' heads, and rode away, one into the setting sun, the other into the green shadows of the grove. Neither looked back. Next day, Robert learned why he had not heard from these zealous hermits for so long. When the community of Tonnerre had thwarted their original plan, they had struggled along as they had been doing. But soon their unrest had grown. They needed a leader. They wanted someone to take them along the way to God. They knew such a person and resolved to obtain him. Finally, they hit on the one way. One of their number went to Rome. He presented their plea to His Holiness, who listened sympathetically and finally granted them the rescript that brought Robert from St. Aul's. The pilgrimage to Rome and back had taken time. But now, yes, now, thought Robert. He studied the 7 men, looked into the tiny cells they had constructed for themselves, inspected their small garden, and then made a general survey of the immediate surroundings. He was wasting no time before getting an insight into the lives of these men. And his most thrilling discovery was that their common desire was for the rule of St. Benedict in its purity. Before the evening star was shining solitary in the white sky, Robert was thanking God from an overflowing heart. The community was small. He considered that an advantage. They had not lived in any of the monasteries of the day. He considered this a greater advantage. They appeared perfectly docile, and that was the greatest advantage. Robert almost wept as he talked to God that night. Here there was nothing to reform. There were no customs to abolish, no mitigations to rescind. All he had to do was fulfill their desire and his own by giving them the rule of St. Benedict in its simplicity. It seemed that the rebel had co-workers at last. His dream was coming true. He could now live the nobler way. Before a month had passed, Robert had the community completely organized along the lines of the rule. He even had his prior, a hermit who had especially impressed him the very first day. He was the most cheerful of the group and one of the most energetic. When the man told him his name was Alberic, Robert said, "It should have been Hilary. I like your smile, Father. Keep it ever shining." Alberic smiled wider at that and whispered, "Owls can only hoot, dogs can only bark, and I can only smile. A leopard can't change his spots, Reverend Father." "No," retorted Robert, "but an abbot can change positions. From now on, you are prior." Alberic broke out into a laugh and said, "I'm here to obey." "The first command, then, is to keep smiling." Alberic bowed and immediately fulfilled the first command. Robert's early moves were significant. He remembered Maurice's charge about forcing his subjective interpretation on others, so every morning, just after their sunrise song, he gathered his little group about him and discussed the rule. He told them just what had happened to that rule during the centuries and what was happening to it today. He was most honest. After his talk, he invited discussion and suggestions. The result was that the Cluniac order of the day was adopted, and many of Cluny's more rigorous customs, but to a man, the hermits begged for poverty, simplicity, solitude, and hard manual labor. It was just what Robert wanted. He was very happy over their determination, and he showed it. When he told them that they must be ready for misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and even ridicule, Alberic spoke up and said, "Oh, don't worry, Reverend Father. There will be only 3 classes of men who will misunderstand us." "Only 3?" asked Robert. "Only 3, repeated Alberic. "The young, the middle-aged, and the old." Robert laughed and admitted that only those 3 classes would be misunderstood. Robert laughed and admitted that only those 3 classes would misunderstand. With the months, Robert's happiness mounted. It seemed that after 40 years of waiting, his dream was coming true. The waiting had been long, and at times he had been very lonely. But now it all seemed eminently worthwhile. He grew younger. He felt bigger, better, braver. He went to rest these nights more tired than ever before, but always less weary. And never did that paradoxical distinction strike him with more force than when he recalled bedtime at Tonnerre. For a full year, nothing troubled the abbot. The community had almost doubled. They were 13 now. But then one morning he called Alberic. He was worried. The little community was not well. Sicknesses had been recurring and recurring lately. Alberic tried to cheer him by saying, "Nothing serious, Reverend Father, just little shadows, that's all." But sure, shadows are proof that the sun is shining. But Robert insisted that the sicknesses were becoming chronic and that they must make a thorough investigation. As the weeks went by, they probed into many possibilities. The diet was watched. 1 meal a day, and that of vegetables, taken during Lent at sundown and outside of Lent at about 2 in the afternoon, was hardly calculated to produce physical giants, men of strong sinew, hard muscle, and brawn. And yet it was universally admitted as sufficient to keep men in sound health. The two superiors soon concluded that it was not the diet alone that was causing the illnesses in the community. They then looked into the manner of work, the amount of sleep, and even into the mental habits of the ailing brethren. The frown only deepened between Robert's eyes. After more than a month of such investigation, Alberic suddenly said, "We've looked behind us, we've looked about us. It's time we look before us." "Meaning?" prompted Robert. "Meaning that it's not the food, it's not the lodging, it's not the labor. Nor is it the combination of fasting, watching, and work. It's the place." "You mean Colon?" "I mean that Colon is unhealthy." Robert consulted everyone he could on the matter. All agreed with Alberic. Robert wondered what he should do. Then from out of nowhere came an echo. It was Morris's voice. It was saying, "Trust in God, sailor, but row for shore." The abbot chuckled. He's right. Presumption is not a virtue. Prudence is. Piety does not consist in impracticality. We shall move. And Robert kept his resolve. Autumn of 1075 saw the little band of 13 lose itself in the seclusion of the forest of Moulins. Some months before, Robert had gone to Burgundy and there found a place that he considered ideal. It was far from any village, that meant solitude. It was virgin territory. That meant hard manual labor. It was healthy. That meant the rule in all its vigor could be observed. Poverty in its every aspect, thought Robert, would find fulfillment at Moulins. Nature was gaudy in her garb of green, gold, russet, red, and burnished brown as the little band plunged deep into the wood. But these men gave her no second glance. They had eyes only for the white of winter. They well knew that after the frost would come the snows. And these men were builders. And such builders. Trees came down, branches were lopped off, trunks split open, and an oratory arose. It was not much to look at. Even Alberic had to say it was picturesque rather than Romanesque. But crude as it was, it satisfied this handful of ardent men. It was their house of God. They knew it to be the very heart of their whole establishment and realized that if this did not pulse with warm love and life, the rest of the buildings would be but the tomb for a corpse. All autumn and even some of winter went in the construction of their little oratory. For themselves, they constructed tiny cells from the lopped-off branches. This motley collection of small huts, clustering around a rude wooden oratory, was the original Abbey of Moulins. In the snows of late December 1075, the little church was dedicated. To Robert, the evening star looked not so lonely. He now had his monastery, his men, and his movement. He thanked God and swore to be gallant. One day, when the jonquils were just pushing through the remaining patches of snow, Robert came upon Alberic wrestling with an unwieldy tree stump. Without a word, he bent over and helped his prior roll the stubborn thing to the side of the clearing. As they both paused for breath, the abbot smiled and pointed to the long line of shapeless trunks as he said, "That represents a winter of work." "And this," replied Alberic, gesturing toward the clearing, "represents a spring of no leisure and a summer of hard labor. But," he added with a smile, "I hope it also represents an autumn with harvests. We can't eat stumps." "No," said Robert slowly, "we can't. But tell me, how high are your hopes for a harvest?" "Virgin soil will not give bumper crops the first year tilled," replied Alberic honestly. "However, we'll trust God." Then, with a wide grin, he added, "And row for shore." "It looks to me as if you've been rowing all winter. Come, show me all you've done." Alberic first took his abbot to a distant spot in the woods and showed him a deep ditch. This was the beginning of an aqueduct, he explained. The mountain stream yonder was to be harnessed so that the monastery and its gardens would never know drought. Then he took Robert to where a cistern was being sunk. Cold water would be welcome after the summer solstice, was Alberic's opinion. The abbot smiled. Then, wheeling him around, Alberic took Robert far back in the woods and pointed to a swamp. "This is to be drained," he said. "It will provide arable ground when it dries." Then, looking up, he pointed and said, "Those monks yonder are leveling that hill and filling the gullies round about, for one day we will be a waving field of wheat." Optimus, laughed Robert. But just then the ring of an axe broke on their ears. Robert looked his question. "That," smiled Alberic, "is my optimism. I sent 2 of our monks to prepare lumber for the barn we haven't got, to house the stock we do not own." "You've got faith, Father Prior," said the abbot, "and hope." Then more seriously and more softly he added, "and charity." "Just at present I've got plenty of work," said Alberic. "We may not be the chivalrous knight you long for us to be, Reverend Father. We may not be as gallant to God as you think monks ought to be, but at least you must admit that we are the manual laborers you say Benedictines should be. That much of your reform is accomplished." "I'm glad you call it reform, Alberic. Others are calling it rebellion." "Who?" "Monks of other monasteries," said the abbot. "We are being criticized." "Good," cried Alberic. "That will bring us to people's attention. Our critics are doing us a favor. They are stirring up curiosity. You can prepare for postulants, Reverend Father. 2 kinds, the merely curious and the sincerely zealous. And I," he added as he moved off, "must prepare more ground for both kinds." Alberic proved a prophet. The curious did come. They found that for once, rumor was right. The men at Moulins were living a stricter life than other men in the land. Most of these were merely curious, so after a week or so they left. But the zealous also came and rejoiced that rumor was so right. They stayed and became grubbers of the soil in order to glorify God.